Short stories and excerpts from old Imperial Guard codexes. Codex Battlezone Cityfight, published in the year 2001. Veteran Sergeant Hessel of the 122nd Cadian Regiment, paragraphs on pages 2, 4, 23 and 70. In my years with the regiment, I fought on the burning sulphur fields of Crogus IV, on the blizzard-swept plains of Mons Frigidus, and in the hard vacuum of deep space. But none of these matched the horrors I faced fighting in the ruined streets of Vagan. It was a blasted, smoke-pale hell, where death lurked at every turn, and where brave men went insane from fear and suffering. I thanked the Emperor that I survived, and I prayed to him that I'll never have to return to such a place again. Remember the first day we entered Vagan. The city had already been blasted by artillery and N-bolts, Imperial Navy thunderbolts, and not one building was left fully standing. Rubble choked the streets, which meant that us footsloggers got to go in first. I was green in those days, and I can remember thinking that no one could have survived in that cauldron of destruction. The next second a sniper got poor old Sergeant Svegan, and the rebel sewer rats attacked us from behind, and then were fighting for our lives with knives, fraggers and rifle butts. Only 4 of us survived out of my squad. I never thought Vagan was going to be easy again after that. Some people think that city fighting is all the same, but I can tell you that it isn't. In Vagan, we had to fight the rebels on the streets, in buildings and in the sewers, and every street, building and sewer was different. We were ordered to capture city blocks, clear strong points, or defend a building at all costs, and every mission was different. There were more ways to fight than there were planets in the Imperium, and even more ways to die. The Chaos Tate had only embraced Ulfat for a few months, but when we landed to retake it, a nightmare awaited us. Flayed human skin flapped from every streetlight. Everywhere you looked, grinning skulls were piled in pyramids, and always just around the corner was an infernal giggling and crackling that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We lost almost as men to the madness as we did to enemy action. Page 3, Long Story of Sergeant Marnak of the 122nd Cadians. Another explosion rocked the building, sending a shower of grey dust from the ceiling, but Sergeant Marnak of the 122nd Cadians barely noticed. His cheeks were sunken and his eyes ringed with black circles. The sergeant gripped the stock of his las gun and tried to get some rest, but, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't quite block out the rumbling sound of a city at war. The crash of artillery vied with the roaring of distant flames and moans of the wounded. His squad had been stuck here for 2 days now, trapped in this shattered building, forced to wait for armoured support before they could advance any further into Vagan. Marnak could recall very little in the last few days, just nightmare memories of bloody hand-to-hand fighting and mad scrambles from ruined buildings along rubble-choked streets. He lost count of the number of times they'd stormed fortified enemy positions through minefields, razor wire, and lethal volleys of gunfire and grenades. An assault that had started nearly 5,000 strong had been reduced to less than 800 men. Somehow he managed to avoid being killed, and Marnak prayed to the Emperor that his luck would hold true throughout this hellish war zone. He glanced around the room they now sheltered in, at the haggard guardsmen that had survived this long. A coating of mud and dust rendered the men of his squad an anonymous grey. Only Jenks looked different, and that was only because he was bloody from the belly down. He'd taken a sniper's bolt around in the gut when they'd holed up here, and died screaming as the blood flooded into a huge pool on the floor. They'd propped him up by the window and used his corpse to try and flush at the sniper by watching for muzzle flashes, but wherever he was, he wouldn't be fooled. Jenks was proven to be as useless in death as he'd been in life. He risked a glance through the barricade pushed over the entrance at the building's rear as he heard the squeal of iron tank tracks and pushed himself upright with a groan. 2 Leman Russ battle tanks idled behind the building, their engines rumbling throatily as a mud-caked lieutenant sprinted bent over towards him. Marnak linked towards the barricade and on his way past wrapped his knuckles in Jenks' helmet. He paused and said, "Come on, soldier, look alive." A few chuckles greeted the oft-repeated joke, but most of the men were too exhausted to bother. It had become a bit of a ritual amongst the squad to repeat the joke, like a mantra to ward off Jenks' bad luck. Marnak partially disassembled the barricade to allow the lieutenant to enter the room. The officer's eye scanned the guardsman, finally setting on Marnak. He removed his helmet and ran a hand through his sweat-streaked hair, mopping his brow with a tattered bandana. "I'd put that helmet back on, sir," advised Marnak. "A lot of sniper activity around here." "Oh yes, of course," replied the lieutenant sheepishly. "Are you Sergeant Marnak?" Marnak nodded as the officer continued. "Sergeant Marnak, I've got orders for you." The two lemon rust battle tanks rumbled slowly down what was once a prosperous mercantile district. Glass, concrete and twisted girders lined the smoke-filled streets, and Marnak could see they were less than 100 metres from their objective. Battlezone called it Building 235, which, in Marnak's opinion, didn't sound like something worth dying for. Yet that was almost a certainty, he glumly realised. Suddenly a trio of missiles speared from the building, trailing bright contrails and impacting on the tank's turret with an almighty clang. The missiles corkscrewed wildly away from the tank, exploding high above it, and Marnak smiled grimly as he realised the traitor had made a fatal error. They'd obviously been waiting for the tanks to close to ensure their weapons hit, but now the range was too short, and the missiles' war spirits didn't have time to arm themselves. The tanks ground to a halt, their turrets tracking round to where the missiles had come from, and fired their mighty battle cannons in unison. The noise was deafening, and the ground shook with the vibration of their firing. The massive shells blasted the building's facade off, smoke boiling from its interior, and jagged chunks of masonry cascading from its frontage. Marnak was gratified to see a host of mangled bodies amongst the rubble. Lieutenant Battlezone drew his chainsword and shouted to the assembled guardsmen, "For the Emperor! Charge!" Marnak sprinted after the lieutenant, shaking his head. The damn fool was going to get himself killed like that. He let out his own cry, terror and anger lending his leg strength as he ran, firing from the hip. Small arms fire pattered harmlessly from the armour of the tank and burst amongst the men of Marnak's squad. Troutman went down, and half a dozen others whose names he didn't know. More were cut down before they finally reached the building, and Marnak slammed his back into the building's wall, his heart pounding like a jackhammer. He snapped a couple of frags from his belt and hurled them through the giant hole the tanks had blasted. The grenades detonated with a teeth-loosening force, smokes and creams issuing from inside. Marnak hurled himself into the building, snapping off shots left and right. The lieutenant followed him, firing his latch pistol and waving his sword like a madman. Two bloody rebels appeared from the smoke, dazed and blackened. Marnak didn't give them a chance to recover and cut them down with two swift shots. More troopers poured inside, and Marnak knew they had to keep moving. A single grenade in their midst could end the assault before it even begun. He thundered his foot into a door and dived through, rolling to a firing crouch and drawing his sword and pistol. He shot a rebel defence trooper before him in the face, swaying aside as another swung his rifle butt at his head. Marnak kicked him in the groin and slashed his sword across his throat. He roared with unfettered fury, a release of pent-up aggression, and continued the slaughter. For another 2 bloody hours, the Cadians rampaged through Building 235, fighting and killing with desperate savagery. As the last squad reported their sector clear, Marnak slid down against a wall, dropping his pistol and sword from bruised hands. He was utterly drained. He bled from a score of wounds, and only now did he feel the pain of his injuries. The frenetic, heart-pounding danger of the battle was over, and a mix of emotions bubbled up within him. Hate, fear, elation, and sadness. Less than a quarter of the men had survived the assault, but Building 235 was theirs. Marnak just hoped it was worth it. He saw the lieutenant marching towards him, his eyes aflame, and Marnak knew that he must have had fresh orders for him. Marnak closed his eyes as he realised that the day's butchery was not yet over. Page 6, short story. Quietly, the quintet of orca-clad troops picked their way down the corridor of the bombed-out workshop, moving through the dust-filled air, but Koelia could hear the hollow crackle of their terse vox signals barking back and forth. He slid back into cover and made a hand gesture that his company could read. They moved back, swallowed by the shadows and the dust. Goal let the 5 troopers advance down the hallway, far enough until the last one is standing on the false flooring. Then he connected the bare ends of the loose wire in his hand to the terminals of the battery pack. The concussion mine tore out a length of the corridor and obliterated the last trooper where he stood, tearing the one directly in front of him into pieces with fragments of shrapnel and shards of bone from his exploded comrade. The other three fell, then scrambled up, firing blind in the smoke. Bright darting blasts of las fire pierced the smoke cover like reef fish scudding through cloudy water. Goal smashed out the fake wall and came down on the first of them from the rear, swinging the hook bill of his axe rake down through the helmet and skull. Sergeant Haller dropped down from the ceiling joists where he had been crouching and felled another of them, killing him with point-blank shots from his auto pistol as his body weight flattened the trooper. The remaining Zorkan switched to full auto and swung wildly. His withering close-range shots punched right through the flakboard, wall partition, and blew the guts and thigh out of Machinesmith Vidor, who was waiting to spring out from behind it. Nessa came out from cover under some loose sacking and slammed the rock knife into the back of the Zorkan's neck. She held on, screaming and yanking at the blood-slick knife grip as the trooper bucked convulsively. By the time he dropped, his head was nearly sawn off. Gaul hurried forward, picked up Nessa, and pulling her off the corpse. She handed the bloody rock knife to him, shaking. "Keep it up," he mouthed. She nodded. Eardrums ruptured by a close shell on the seventh day. She would never hear again without expensive uphive surgery and implants. "You did good," Gaul sighed. She smiled, but the fear in her eyes and the blood on her face diffused the power of the expression, undulled the beauty of this young woman. "Not so easy," she sighed back. Being now unable to modulate the volume of her own voice, she learned to sign her remarks early on. Gaul looked round. Haller and the other members of Gaul's team had recovered 4 working las guns, 2 las pistols, and a bunch of ammunition webs from the dead by then. "Go, move," Gaul ordered. He took a last look at Vidor's corpse and nodded a moment of respect. He had liked Vidor. He wished the brave machinesmith had found the chance to fight. Then he followed his company out. Lords of the Night. Battle report on pages 33, 42, 45, 46, and 47. The 2 traitor space marines were in shadow. The saucer Asimondus stood with his legs braced, holding his staff out before him. Faint traceries of quicksilver glittered in the air around it as the warp obeyed his will. Despite his evident and intense concentration, he glanced up to his companion and grinned hawkishly. "Have you ever noticed, brother, how so much of the battle has revolved around this one accursed building?" "Of course I have," replied his comrade. "First the RBT stall our rebel friends there long enough for the defences to be organised. Then, having paid the blood price, the fools lose it without a fight when their lines were broken by the Imperial fists. Gorismeth was marginally shorter than the sorcerer, but broader, his shape cloaked by his folded raptor wings, and, despite his steady voice, he flexed his lightning claws impatiently as he spoke. "Sorcerer, I want to send the Emperor's lackeys a message that this is not over, that the fear will always be with them. That prescient house is a symbol of this city defiance, and it must be destroyed. The fools have prepared it to serve as their arsenal, and by their actions have served my purpose. Speak, sorcerer, is it time?" Asamondius did not reply. His eyes were far away. Captain Fane started as the comm blink burst into life. It was clearer than usual. Normally Costman, the comm operator, had to adjust it carefully, but he was on the other side of the room making caffeine. He was glad it was clear, though, because the incoming orders were important. He leapt up, pulling on his helmet and grabbing his kit. "Costman, combat kit now." "Didn't you hear the new orders? We're moving out, so move." Costman looked blankly at his officer, and then with the resignation of the bemused common soldiers throughout the Imperium, he obeyed. Shouldering his lasgun, he followed Fane, pausing only to pick up the comlink and ensure that it was still switched off. A few city blocks away, Asamundus looked up. "They are leaving, but they'll quickly forget why. Hurry." With a hiss of anticipation, Gorismus spread his wings and leapt skyward, already issuing the order for his concealed troops to advance. The street echoed to the amplified roar of the Chaos Dreadnought. its plasma cannon glowing like a small sun as it disgorged raw energy, each bolt creating bubbling pools of molten matter where the road once was. The Cadians flinched from the heat only to find themselves under fire from the roof of the Celarian, the storm of explosive bolts forcing them back. A further burst from the roof of the prescient house forced them back the other way, men clutching at their flak jackets as the long-range shot struck home. The whole platoon swayed under the terrible volley, cut down like wheat before the sieve. The high-flying raptors landed at the rear of the formation and rushed into them like shrieking demons. And yet through the din, they heeded Fane's words. "Are you not Cadians? Stand up and fight." One by one they rose to their feet, ignoring the sickening sight of the armoured fist squad being ripped apart by the raptors. The 122nd turned once again to face the prescient house. As Private Wiley waited for his loader to choose the next target, he was startled to find a target chose them. At the edge of the ruins in front of them, a massive winged Chaos Marine rose from a crouch to his full height and turned to face them. Wiley heard his loader swear under his breath. Standing at least a foot taller than any of them, the Chaos Marine lifted his arms out to each side, offering himself as a target. And he heard a voice of velvet edged with steel speak to them. "Am I not a heretic? Punish me in the name of your false emperor. But beware, for death and I are old friends." Wiley heard his loader yelling, "Fire, fire, fire!" and saw his squad's mate's lasgun fire explode across the traitor's armour before he fired his missile launcher. Miraculously, one of the lasgun bolts found a weakness in the giant's knee plate, and he tumbled to one side, just as Wiley's crack missile slashed through the space he had been standing in. Wiley felt physically sick. He heard the rich laughter of his enemy coming close, but didn't look up. He knew full well what was coming. "Traitors, heretics, turn and face us. It's cleansing time," Sergeant Dejano roared like a madman as he triggered his flamer. The line of Chaos Marines were engulfed in flame. From below the parapet, two further gouts of flame roared up over the centralized wall, reefing the Knife Lords in a sea of living flame. Dejano laughed and cried at the same time, certain that after their charge through hell to get there, the 122nd had once again triumphed. Then the flames died and the Chaos Marines turned to face Dejano and their comrades. Their ceramite armour was blackened, but not one had fallen. With a precise click, a line of bolters was brought to bear. Down in the courtyard, Captain Fane heard the voice of Sergeant Dejano crying out in despair, ended by a burst of bolter fire and cruel laughter. Rather than flying into combat, the Chaos Lord landed on the ramp to the courtyard and ran towards Fane in a low crouch. The first guardsman thrust too soon. A slight twist of Goromus' left claw deflected the bayonet, and before the guardsman could recover his weapon, the right claw raked his throat, and he fell, gurgling to the floor. The second guardsman was more careful, waiting for the traitor's rush before stabbing. His bayonet glanced off the ceramite breastplate, jarring his shoulder and entangling in the raptor jump back wing. The lightning-swift slice off the assailant's claws cut off his hands, leaving the lasgun dangling from the towering Night Lord. With a sudden change of balance, Gorosmith kicked out, sending a crate of ammunition that must have weighed as much as a man flying at the surviving Cadians. The last guardsman, Corporal Riley, shouldered Fane aside and grunted as the crate smashed into them. He'd already thrown away his flamer, and a long fighting knife with a notched wooden handle was in his hand. Instinctively he dropped, rolling with the crate's impact just as the claws parted the air above him. Stabbing upward, he grappled with Gorosmith, desperation granting him the strength to hold back the massive Chaos Space Marine and shout, "Captain, now!" Back on guard, Captain Fane raised his power sword and saw that Gorosmith's guard was down as he shifted his grip on the brave guardsman, his barbed claws slicing through armour. From a nearby street, the sorcerer Alzamondrus watched the battle through his mind's eye and spoke quietly. "No, not before we have your soul," he said, his body tensing briefly and then relaxing. In the prescient house courtyard, Fane's hand twisted involuntarily on the hilt as the blade descended, catching Gorosmos with the flat of the blade only. The next thing Fane heard was the guardsman being crushed in Gorosmos' cold bear hug. Riley's bones cracked, and he was dropped like a broken rag doll at Fane's feet. Fane stood alone, his sword hanging limply by his side, the bodies of his platoon stretching out before him. He felt despair and terror all around him, like a shroud as the gaze of the Chaos Lord fell upon him. The urge to cower and beg, to promise anything to prevent his doom, welled up inside him. Just then, his eyes glimpsed the banner of the 122nd lying in the dirt, and a decade of martial pride pushed the tendrils of dark sorcery from his mind. Straightening, he met Gorosmos' gaze and spat, "Traitor!" before the claws cut out his heart. Alright, there you have it. Short stories and excerpts from the Codex Battlezone Cityfight. If you enjoyed the last 20 minutes and have any feedback for me as I try to improve this concept and format, please let me know. You can check out another one I've done for Codex Cadian from I think back in the year 2000. I'm going to continue to do more and more codexes over the historical timeline of Astra Militarum Imperial Guard. But yep, if you want to support me, you can do so with a like, comment, or by subscribing, joining my Patreon platoon, or simply watching any of my other YouTube videos. A massive thanks to my current supporters. Let's get your bayonet sharp, lasgun oiled. Faith for the Emperor strong. Patreon platoon, sound off. Tank Commander Glenn. Tank Commander Watchdog Van Etten. Tank Commander Mitchell. Colour Sergeant DuPont. Sergeants Adal, the Colonel Merrill. Veteran Gibson, Hall, Lundeen. Guardsman Beard, Coquelin, Flint, Hills, Malik, Nitton, Nguyen, Smith, Tom, Tompkin. Conscripts England, Gilliam, Goodwin.